Before I welcome Maya Inbar with us, I have to announce, as always, that we are being recorded. You are being recorded. We have an ever-growing library of language circle talks online. If you don't want to be recorded, then please shut down your camera online. If you're in the room, you don't want to be recorded, please step into one of the corners outside of the view of the camera. The second thing I always need to announce is that unfortunately, when we have the discussion, but also throughout the presentation, you cannot really unmute yourself and just speak up with a question. And that's just a safety measure, because in the past we had a couple of kids storming the chat, and that was scary, and I don't want that to happen again. So we blocked this possibility. So if you want to ask a question, you want to engage in the discussion, then please give us a sign, either with an icon, with a little one of these little icons, or by typing your question into the chat, and then Caro is happy to unmute you, of course. Sorry for the inconvenience. Now, I think now it's my pleasure to introduce Maya Inbar from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'm very glad that you made it to Leipzig, and we already had some nice occasions last evening, and I'm also looking forward to seeing you at the workshop in Berlin, of course, on Thursday and Friday. Maya is a graduate student in the joint HUGIJITAU program in linguistics.
Yeah,
we have a linguist in the language circle again, yeah? So there's more to her, I think. She wrote her master's thesis under the supervision of Eitan Grossman and Ayelet Landau, whom we had here as a guest previously. Maya is currently studying the cognitive neuroscience of interpersonal communication. Linguist, but she's studying communication. And for some people in the audience, this may mean something, and it's a nuance that I really like, and brings to the study of brain electrophysiology usage-based approaches to language. And that's also a rare thing, I think, throughout the neurobiology of language. Most people have been studied in the formalist tradition, looking at language in isolation, at how it works and how it's implemented, and thinking it's really an encapsulated system, and that's the only way to study it. And if you're from linguistics, you know that there's another camp who's more looking at language as in an integrated manner, looking at it more like a biologist in terms of how it evolved in context, what the different biological factors are. And that's, believe it or not, rare in the neurobiology of language. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm really, really happy to have Maya here. Maya has been awarded the MA Excellence Prize of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel School for Advanced Studies in the Humanities in 2016. And since 2018 is a fellow in the PhD honors program at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel School for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. And is that right, that you're still a graduate student?
I have happy news. I submitted my dissertation.
Yeah, okay, I wasn't sure.
In August, so.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Impressive body of work already. And also like the way that you combine your influence from linguistics with contemporary views in cognitive neuroscience and systems neuroscience. That's, I think it's, I don't know if that's one of a kind, but I would say it's rare. And of course, we share that approach and that view. That's what we're doing here, we're teaching here. And so we are very inspired by your work so far. And that's also why we're really looking forward to your presentation now. Thank you for joining us. And the floor is yours, Maya.
Thank you very much. It's a really nice introduction. I hope to stand up for it in the talk. And yeah, so like I'm really excited to be in this great circle of the forum and open this year with you. So actually, just before I start, I will say that I brought as a token another circle, which is this pomegranate for you to, I don't know, put on a window and have nice light from. And it just symbolizes the opening of the Hebrew year that happens in the fall also, and many more things. So this is for the lab.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. It's from the Israel Museum. You. Okay. So please let me know if I should speak up a little louder. I tend to. And yeah, I'll focus today on temporal dynamics in language use. And I'll just start right away with my agenda. I'll spend some time at the beginning of this talk introducing intonation units, and I'll really dedicate this time to properly showcase this usage-based approach that Lars was mentioning and is really the reason I am doing this research. So I'm sorry if the introduction will be a little long, but I promise to get to the EEG study later. And basically, just what I will be talking about today is we had an EEG study in which we modeled the response to intonation units in spontaneous speech. People were listening to spontaneous speech. And in the first analysis I will present, we show that intonation units evoke an EEG response. And then we will turn to the world of brain rhythms that is very familiar to this crowd and consider its relation to intonation units. And the bottom line we will get to is that when we use the response to intonation units to predict continuous EEG signals, this helps us understand better the phenomena of delta band speech tracking. Yeah, so maybe a word at the outset. I think this group is the most familiar with this work as can be. So I really hope that we take this talk as an opportunity to discuss and yeah, maybe learn even more. So I will be happy to take questions along the way if that's not too technically difficult. Okay. Yeah, so I studied cognitive science and linguistics, and specifically usage-based linguistics. And what I want to do in my research is to really look at the neural underpinnings of language while maintaining the usage-based mindset, which really isn't the most popular thing to do. So what does it mean? It means to keep in mind that the actual spontaneous way we use language can be revealing about the structure of the system. And I mean, think about the last conversation you had. Many of these things really go under our consciousness, okay? The way we, for example, ask for or give information, the way we organize the speech and sequence between speakers. There are clear systematic routines to these processes, but we know very little about their neural underpinnings. And yeah, I guess I'm working under the assumption that this spontaneous use of language for social interaction is foundational to how the knowledge of language is organized. So I would like to explore this. Now, obviously, I did not yet do social interaction per se, and I mainly looked at ongoing continuous speech as we listen to it. Now, in spontaneous spoken language, I treat voice as king. And of course, there are very interesting motor and visual aspects to language use on the sides of both the speaker and the listener. But I think theoretically know comparatively less about them. It's a growing field, and I hope to study that one too. And I know some of you are also looking at these interactions. So yeah, what is it that I study? So when we look at spontaneous spoken language, instead of the text meeting the retina, eye movement by eye movement, organized in words separated by spaces, this is just a beautiful Hebrew, we have continuous sound reaching our ears, and we need to decipher it. And as speakers, we have to produce connected speech, but we cannot speak entirely continuously, right? And so we break our speech into little segments. So intonation units are essentially these segments. And the linguist Wallace Chafe noticed that the segmentation of continuous speech doesn't happen randomly in time or just whenever we need to breathe. It rather seems to reflect internal thought processes. And I'll get to this soon. And I'll just mention that in other linguistic traditions, even those that focus less on spontaneous spoken language, so the same types of prosodic segments are also known by intonation as intonation phrases, tone groups, and more. So, I mean, you might be familiar with these units in one way or another from one literature. Okay, so what defines intonation units? We typically look for several auditory properties, auditory cues. I list them here. And yeah, let's go over them slowly. Okay. So as we speak, okay, the changes in the height of our voice, the intonation pattern, then we stretch it over an utterance. Okay. And as we finish the utterance, we begin another utterance and a new intonational contour. So when we are looking for intonation units in continuous speech, we really look for these resets in the height of our voice. Okay, this reset in pitch is also often accompanied by resets in volume. And yeah, like before I speak about pauses, maybe the most salient cue for intonation unit boundaries is a change in syllable delivery rate. Okay, particularly utterance final speech tends to be a little longer. And then when we start a new unit, syllable rate is much faster. Okay, so let's just listen to this last salient cue, an example. This is an example taken from the Santa Barbara corpus of spontaneous American English, already a very established corpus. There are many more now. And I transcribed for you intonation units on separate lines. Okay, so let's follow.
We walked around, we went to a park, and we just talked and talked and sat in the sun, and we had such a nice day.
Right. Yeah. So often when we try to segment spontaneous speech, we look for pauses, right? But intonation units are a little more subtle than interpausal units. And some of the units in this example and in a lot of our data are actually auditorily separable with virtually no pause in between, like 50%, okay, a lot. And yeah, we'll hear this example once again, and you can really appreciate that there is no silence between intonation units often. So what allows us to perceive these units as separate segments? And I think the literature is sort of converging that a very prominent cue is the lengthening of syllables at utterance final positions, okay? So think about Sunday, okay? And here I just measured the durations of the different syllables in the last intonation unit. And you see that the day, which happens to be the last syllable, is 430 milliseconds long, which is 3 times longer than the first syllable we. Yeah, and I see Stephanie is in the crowd, so I know studies also looking at this cue as a very salient cue for intonation unit boundaries. Yeah, so let's maybe listen to the example once again. We can appreciate the final lengthening, the maybe lesser contribution of pauses. See?
We walked around, we went to a park, and we just talked and talked and sat in the sun, and we had such a nice day.
Yeah. So once attention is directed to these cues, we can readily define auditory segments and spontaneous speech with relatively good reliability between listeners. And this is really how we annotate our data. Okay, so expert linguists listen closely and transcribe. They listen to these auditory cues and reach inter-rate record. Okay, so these auditory units, which from the perspective of the speaker are little production units, because they're defined in part based on our physiology, we view them as sort of shared across the species, I guess. So in linguistics, and especially in typological studies of linguistic variation, intonation units have a status of being a language universal. And indeed, they have been found in every language that's been studied. Yeah, so like doing research on language processing with these units in mind seemed to offer, like to me, an a priori possibility to generalize the theory across languages. But I want to confess that my interest in doing research in these units very much stems from their importance in communication. So even if they were only in one language, I would like to study them. And really now I'll dedicate the next couple of slides to talk about the roles of intonation unit in communication. So I guess when I was an undergraduate, I read some discourse analysis studies, and I learned from them that intonation units seem to have a role in pacing the flow of information in the discourse. Okay, so in what way? In conversation, as speakers, we build a common ground between us step by step, okay? We cannot throw all the information all at once, but rather when developing a narrative, for example, we would introduce the setting, the participants, and the course of events in a gradual manner. And what we see is that intonation units seem to take on this role of pacing the information, and that effectively there seems to be an upper bound to the amount of information contained within each intonation unit. So just shortly presenting this with our previous English example. So this conversation was actually taken from a phone call that a woman was telling her boyfriend about the day she spent trips with friends. And the story started much earlier in the conversation. So at the point that this example is said, the speaker and her friends refer to here by we. So they're already accessible reference, okay? So here in the first line and following, we is not new material relative to the discourse. However, together in the same intonation unit, walked around is a new piece of information. And in such a way, we can analyze the rest of the examples and sort of get this qualitative feeling that ideas that call for introduction relative to the preceding discourse are produced one at a time. Okay, so walked around and went to the park in two separate units. Yeah, I guess the theory all along or the working assumption is that this derives from cognitive constraints on the amount of new information that people can produce and comprehend. But yeah, I mean, does it? I'm not here to answer this question, but that is what I'm interested in. Okay. So yeah, I guess the working assumption is that this prosodic musical structure of language is a kind of guide to the attention of the listener to parcels of new information. Okay. Now, this is an important role discussed in the literature, but we also know that intonation units are key to the construction of interaction in additional ways. So as speakers in conversation, for example, we use them to plan when it is our turn to start talking. And in linguistic terms, to time turn transitions. And how so? Okay, so the prosodic characteristics of intonation units that we discussed before, they seem to foreshadow each unit's trajectory and thus make its completion predictable. And we know that speakers use these predictions to plan when it is their turn to talk. And by now, this has also been shown qualitatively and experimentally. And I know there's nice research in the lab with this question, which I'm looking forward to read about. Yeah, so I guess there's also growing evidence that prosodic phrasing plays crucial roles in language development, also possibly coming from this lab, I guess, too. And next, finally, we know from many studies that intonation units are related to more traditional linguistic constructs. So be it by strongly corresponding with syntactic phrase structure or to conventionalized phonological patterns. So what do I mean by these? So think of the intonational pattern you would use to ask a question in your language. Okay, so this pattern usually stretches a single intonation unit, but it's specific to your language. And syntactically speaking, if we look across languages, there is a non-negligible tendency of intonation units to contain a simple clause. Okay, so just reminding again of this example, here we really have an abundance of simple clauses. Okay, but we also have other types of material in spontaneous speech. Okay, both at varying syntactic levels and also, I mean, structures that don't fit really well, well-formed categories, okay, like discourse markers and yeah, different speech sounds, okay? So we finished the intro. Is that okay? Are you with me? Okay. So now I will show you that the neural system is attuned to intonation units. We set out to study this with EEG really. And in the setup, native Hebrew-speaking participants, 50 participants eventually, listened to people telling stories in Hebrew while we recorded their EEG. So the auditory stimuli were these really pretty emotional, personal stories told spontaneously and recorded, okay? And this data was collected in Anat Perry's lab by graduate student Shil Gelser. And interestingly, this data was collected for an entirely different research program on social cognitive neuroscience. And it just like appeared to us that we can study it too. Yeah, so these stories, as I said, include entirely naturalistic speech. And for us, it was interesting to tackle this richness, the variability, the covariability in natural speech. So we started by analyzing the stimuli at different levels. We transcribed and time-stamped each word in the stimulus. And then in a prosodic analysis, we listened carefully and identified auditorily the boundaries between the different intonation units. And this level of limitation allows us to group together words that end an intonation unit and separate them from the other words that do not end an intonation unit. And contrasting these two groups of words, we can ask, what is the neural response at the closure of an intonation? Okay, now, obviously, we're studying the response of spontaneous speech uncontrolled. It's a highly complex signal, and intonation units are first and foremost prosodic phrases. So by definition, they include acoustic modulations that can trigger an EEG response that isn't related to the processing of linguistic structure per se. So it was clear to us that to uncover these more functional aspects of intonation units, we need to find a way to control for EEG changes that are just related to the acoustics. Okay, so the next step was to quantify variations in speech acoustics in each and every word. For this, we employed a published algorithm by Suni et al. And I won't go into the details of its computation now, but what I can tell you is that it takes into account two acoustic signals and word duration information. And all these signals are related in one way or another to the auditory cues we discussed earlier, define intonation units. Okay, but not just as such, okay? The algorithm combines these signals and performs a wavelet analysis on them in separate scales. And based on the output of the wavelet analysis, it computes a score for the strength of acoustic modulation in each word, okay? And this is what we call our acoustic-based boundary strength score. And it's intended to control for the expected variation between words in different positions. As it happens, it also allows us to ask, you know, how does the neural response to acoustic boundaries of varying magnitudes, how does it change? So we also asked that. So any questions so far? Okay. Once we analyzed the stimuli linguistically and acoustically this way, we were ready to analyze the EEG data. So we epoched the EEG around each word offset, and we used a GLM approach to model trial level data. So just for some details, I used the Limo EEG toolbox for linearly modeling the EEG data of each subject and electrode at each time point relative to word offset. So this toolbox basically allows for this hierarchical modeling at the subject level and then at a group level, which was something I was interested in. And it also has a neat implementation of like non-parametric bootstrapping statistics at the group level. And I can say I know the group often uses the temporal response function approach. So being a regression-based approach is similar, but not identical. And actually looking forward to implement a more TRF-like analysis to my data. Be happy to talk about it. Okay, so let's turn to the results. Yeah, so First, I would like to show you that the EEG response to a word depends on whether that word closes an intonation unit or not. I'll be showing the difference between words in the two different closure conditions. Words that appear at the end of an intonation unit, what I call intonation final words, and words that do not end in intonation. So purple and green, respectively. And crucially, okay, I'll be comparing words with a given and average acoustic boundary strength. So while holding acoustics constant. And yeah, here we'll see EEG potential relative to the offset of each word, that's the 0 point, separately for intonation unit final words and non-final words. And the grand averages that I will show were computed over this subset of right anterior electrodes. So what we see initially is that the response to intonation unit final words includes a negative deflection in these electrodes as early as 50 milliseconds before word offset. And next, if we again contrast the response in the two different closure conditions, but look at a separate set of central electrodes, we see that the response to intonation unit final words includes a positive deflection, okay, on 150 to 500 milliseconds after word offset. So these figures are here as demonstrative visualizations, but we obtain corresponding significant differences when we explicitly model it in the DLM approach I just described. So this is just a glimpse at the full statistical result. In short, you see a difference in T values, okay, between words that end an intonation unit and words that do not. And the highlighted electrodes are those that are statistically significant after correction. Okay, so there's again, a significant negative deflection at right anterior electrodes, beginning slightly before word offset, and a significant posterior central positive deflection, starting around 150 milliseconds after word offset. Okay. Next, we wanted to know what is the impact of varying acoustic boundary strength on the EEG response. So I'll again present EEG traces to demonstrate this effect, and then turn to the statistics. And for simplicity, I'll focus on intonation unit final words now. And in this figure, different quartiles of boundary strength will be indicated by darkening shades of blue. Okay, so the darker the blue, the stronger the boundary. And you will see a grand average over this subset of anterior electrodes. So beautifully enough, this grand average reveals a gradient response as boundary strength grows. So the stronger the boundary, the more negative the EEG potential is between around 100 to 400 milliseconds afterwards. Yeah, and this effect is also significant in the statistical modeling. And this is the result. Again, the stronger the acoustic boundary, the more negative is the EEG potential in this anterior and frontal set of electrodes. Okay, so this is the first section. We've seen that intonation units evoke a neural response, which we believe might be related to their role in the unfolding discourse, given that we tried to control for the effect of inherent acoustic modulations. Okay. And as you may know, this pattern of results strongly corresponds to an ERP component, I think first described here in Leipzig, called the closure positive shift, whose shape is indeed a positivity in central electrodes at prosodic breaks. In this plot, positivity is plotted downwards. Sometimes the literature also describes a negativity in anterior electrodes, which is similar to what we found, but it's not demonstrated in this figure. And yeah, the CPS, the closure positive shift component, was demonstrated in different languages, though never in Hebrew, to the best of my knowledge. But also, more crucially, only in rather artificial contexts. Okay, so using constructed or digitally manipulated stimuli. And here we saw regression ERPs to unmanipulated continuous speech. And finally, I believe our modeling approach allowed us to separate the contributions of acoustic variation on the one hand, and presumably linguistic structuring on the other. And from what I understood, this was missing. I guess there was a puzzle about the closure positive shift. So let's describe this puzzle. Okay. So on the one hand, we saw studies of the closure positive shift actually emerging when there is no prosodic cue. Okay, if the boundary is predictable based on syntax alone. We also know from studies that contextual predictability can modulate responses to acoustically identical prosodic phrases. And actually also it seems to emerge at the comma when we're just reading sentences and not getting any acoustic content whatsoever. So together these set of results suggest that the closure positive shift reflects in some way a structuring of the input. But on the other hand, there is also evidence that the closure positive shift emerges in the absence of linguistic content at various levels. So also in Jabberwocky sentences, in hum sentences, even to a degree in musical phrases. So the way I understand it is that what type of structure does the CPS reflect was an open question. Okay? And I hope that this multiple regression approach, which I think is the addition, we can separate the different contributions of acoustics on the one hand and structuring of the input. Okay. So moving on to the next part of this talk, I'll turn now to talk about brain rhythms and speech tracking and how intonation units are related to these phenomena. So a general word about brain rhythms in a form that needs no introduction to them. We know that brain rhythms are widespread in the brain in terms of their origin, characteristics, different functions. And I guess like what I learned is that we think that their structural relevance stems from the fact that they represent rhythmic excitability changes of neuronal populations. So supposedly a stimulus arriving at a certain phase will be processed differently than stimuli arriving at different phases. And we know that brain rhythms synchronize to external stimuli, like speech. And we think of the synchronization phenomena, both to external rhythms as well as to different rhythms within the brain, as a mechanism for the selection and routing of information in the brain. Yeah, so I guess specifically in the context of speech processing, a range of studies looked at the relation between brain rhythms and temporal structures in speech. And this is the phenomena we call speech tracking. And it occurs at different timescales, fulfills different roles. I think research is still not finished in this field at all. But specifically about low frequency activity at around 1 cycle per second or 1 hertz, what we call delta band. So this type of speech tracking seems to play crucial roles in higher level language processing, okay? So beyond mere perception. And we wanted to step in to shed light on what units of language are being tracked by low frequency brain activity. And we thought we could shed light on the matter from the lens of intonation units. So why? So me and my master's thesis, and also Lars and additional researchers actually previously found that in spontaneous speech, intonation units succeed each other at a tempo of approximately 1.5 units per second. In our 2020 publication, we showed this for 6 languages from around the world. And currently, actually, I'm preparing a report extending these findings to 50 languages. And when we go to the Minds and Moments workshop in Berlin, you will have a chance to hear about this more. Okay. It's possible to register and get a link to WebEx broadcasting the workshop. Okay. So we hypothesized based on this result that the time course of responses to intonation units should give rise to what we measure as delta band neural speech tracking. And in the following slide, I'll describe to you how we compute speech tracking in the study and then show the involvement of intonation unit related activity in this process. Okay, so in the previous section, I just described our GLM approach, basically how we modeled the impact of a set of variables on the EEG response in an event-related fashion. But what you could then do is extract the fitted model parameters from the event-related model and use them to reconstruct or to predict the continuous EEG response to the stimuli based on the time of each word. And even better, you could predict the continuous EEG data based on only subsets of model parameters at a time. Okay, so for example, just the parameters related to the intonation unit closure condition. Okay, and then what you do is to correlate the model predicted signal with left out empirical EEG data. And then we use the partial Pearson correlation to reach really the unique contribution of this set of stimulus parameters in predicting the continuous EEG, so pressing out other stimulus parameters. And it turns out that this set of parameters related to whether a word closed an intonation unit or not allows to predict unique slow EEG modulations in a wide range of electrodes and in a manner above chance. Okay, so statistically significant. Separately, we can also look at the contribution of the acoustically driven boundary strength scores in predicting the low frequency EEG activity. So this set of parameters also allows to predict unique and significant slow EEG modulations, but in another set of channels. Okay. And finally, the literature often describes E modulations and speech tracking in a faster temporal scale in the theta band. And we checked the contribution of the same set of variables in predicting activity in the theta band, but actually didn't find any to be significant. Okay. So I mean, this band usually is associated with tracking of a different unit of syllables. Okay. And I hope that based on these results, we can conclude that intonation unit related activity seems to be specifically related to delta band or slow EEG modulations. But honestly, I'll be happy to find an influence also on other bands. That's okay. Okay. Yeah. So I guess if I still have a little bit of time, I'll say that I told you earlier that intonation units are strongly related to syntactic phrase boundaries and specifically to the simple clause. So in the review process, and thanks very much to the reviewers, really, we had the opportunity to dig deeper and ask if we might better interpret the effects we found, specifically the intonation unit closure effect, in syntactic terms. So then what we did was to annotate the speech stimuli also at the level of the clause. And we chose the clause level as its definition is relatively agreed upon in different frameworks. You could, of course, do more. And just as a definition for the clause, we took a predicate and all its complements and modifiers. This includes finite as well as non-finite clauses and clauses at a range of syntactic positions. Okay. So in these recordings, out of nearly 1,400 intonation units that we have, some coincide with the ending of a clause while others do not. Okay. On the other hand, when a clause ends, this is overwhelmingly marked prosodically. Okay, an intonation unit ends too. So in this situation, we can ask whether clause closure adds to or perhaps explains away the overall effect that we found for intonation unit closure. And before I answer this question, I would like to point out that it would, I believe, be very difficult for us to assess the effect of clause closure independently of intonation unit closure, particularly in this data. But also if we construct stimuli that with different statistics than our natural speech, perhaps our mind, constructs the prosody implicitly. We actually know this to be the case. Okay. Yeah. So results. We added to our model a predictor to code whether a word ends a clause in addition to an intonation unit. So slightly changing the model parameters from what we had before. And we checked again how well this predicts the continuous EEG data based on subsets of the model parameters. And again, like looking at the unique contribution of our previous sets of parameters, we see that the effects we previously found remain intact and that clause closure predicts an additional different portion of low frequency speech tracking. Okay. So supposedly it does not explain away, perhaps adds more. I think there's a new article also showing something very similar from Tigano is the first author. Okay. Okay. So I'm getting to the discussion. We're on time, right? Okay. Yeah. So I think a major step we did in this work was to bridge between the single evoked response and continuous processes. And like by directly relating low frequency speak tracking and closure positive shift. And what more, I think it's nice to anchor this relationship to a particular linguistic unit, okay, with interesting cognitive and behavioral relevance. I know this was hypothesized to be the case before, and it's nice to be in a position to show it. Yeah, so our modeling approach, as I said before, is similar to the temporal response functions for modeling continuous brain signals and continuous behavior. And we combine this approach with linguistic insights about continuous processes in language. So one may ask, why should we care about continuous processes in language? And then my answer would always be that the primary way we meet language already when we're in the womb is that, like, as it unfolds spontaneously over time. So this must have an effect on the developing brain mechanism that evolves to support language use. And yeah, as I said before, the usage first perspective assumes that how language unfolds over time reveals about the language structures, the different schemes, the different formats we have to use. And here, I guess I would like to join an earlier suggestion to view prosody as a missing link between, a missing link in the embodiment of abstract linguistic knowledge. So how so? Prosody is a sensory motor phenomena, and as such, it can be a basis for the action perception simulation we need to form abstract knowledge. Okay, another discussion point. There's a story to be told between the seeming universality of intonation units and the fact that in the end we can only speak the languages that we speak. It's not enough. The results do speak in part to this divide. So people listening to speech in a foreign language, if you can direct their attention good enough, okay? So they should show a boundary strength effect, okay, an effect to the changing acoustics, but not an intonation unit closure effect. Okay, so that's the prediction I'm making coming out of the study. But then we can ask, okay, what else is happening that allows us to make sense of what we hear? And finally, from a different angle, so I'm excited in my research now, like to learn more about intonation units. So like the field can really benefit from learning more about intonation units. So for example, I always get asked about, what constitutes new information in the discourse. And I mean, we rely on qualitative analyses, but really a formal definition that would allow to operationalize this to large-scale data, it's really missing. I guess there are promising candidates in recent years, thanks to development in the world of probabilistic language models. But I have questions about these models. I mean, I believe they've been raised in a tradition focused on textual edited language. I don't know, do they really capture all that is going on in the discourse so we can use them as measures for what is new information? And finally, what can we gain from considering them together with natural prosodic structure? Okay, so before I thank everybody, the results I reported and more can be found in these two publications. I would like to thank Eitan and Ayelet, my advisors, and Shiren and Nat, our collaborators. They all played really crucial roles in this project. And thank you for listening. These are a few articles. I guess stay tuned to our new report. on the temporal structure of intonation units and ever more languages. Okay.
Thank you, Maya, for the inspiring presentation. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. Maybe we start with the online audience. Just raise a hand, and then Caroline will unmute you. I see Luciana Lucente, I think, has a question.
Can you see that?
No, that's applause.
Yeah, that's applause.
Okay, sorry. Maybe on the second page.
Okay.
Aviat, and then I think you were first, and then Camila. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. It's not so much of a question. So I really enjoyed it. I love the story you're telling. And I'm just wondering to what extent you think this can fit well, because I think it fits really well with the story of chunking from Christensen and Morten. And I think if I understood correctly that the next speaker in this series is going to talk about that, right? One of them. I forgot who. Can you tell me who?
Morten Christensen.
Great. So I like this whole idea of chunking as a necessary way of understanding speech processing fits incredibly well with your story. So that's just a comment, but maybe you have something to say about that. I'll be happy to hear.
The connection is very clear to me also. And I think often when we think about what are the cognitive constraints that bring the one idea constraint, so that directly goes to like Christensen's theory and work. Yeah, so it just like fits very nicely. So I hope this can add to like the underlying neural mechanisms. Yeah.
I think Camila was the next one, and then Stephanie Shatter-Kufnagel. Hi, good to have you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. You were mentioning you had expert linguists annotating the stimuli. So I was wondering if you thought of if there are any automatic ways of finding intonation units. And if there aren't, what would you be looking at, like pitch contour or syllable length?
Okay, so thanks. This is a great question. So actually preparing and validating an automatic method to annotate intonation units is like another part of this study where I extend the scope of the temporal structure to the 50 languages, nearly 50 languages. So yeah, basically I took the SUNY algorithm and looked at the correspondence between like the boundary strength scores and intonation unit final words in languages that I have looked at several different languages. The correspondence is pretty big. And then you can use the claim is that you can use scores that the algorithm gives you and then cluster the intonation units to two separate groups, the words to two separate groups, words that end in intonation unit and words that do not, and in such a way arrive at a segmentation, continuous speech. So yeah, this is in the report. I'm going to upload a preprint of soon, like the third chapter of my PhD. And I mean, I know there are other methods. So for example, there's another measure also like from the Weizmann Institute looking at the durations of phones. So it's like assuming that you have annotations at the phone level, okay, different phonemes. If you look at their relative duration, they validated for English that can arrive at a segmentation, automatic segmentation to intonation units. But it's for English only, I guess, and also having an annotation of each and every phone is very, very difficult to do. Yeah. So the algorithm of SUNY that I mentioned does take into consideration also word annotation. So there is some manual work involved potentially. Maybe it can be alleviated with new like tools. And then, as I mentioned before, it takes into consideration the pitch contour and like the speech envelope, so amplitude fluctuations. Yeah. Was that question coming from a knowledgeable place. I'm always curious to know.
No, I work on reading acquisition in children and in speech processing, how it relates to reading acquisition. And I was thinking that this might be really relevant because there's a lot of effects reported on delta tracking and reading acquisition. And I was wondering, I also work in Spanish, so I was wondering if I wanted to annotate for IU, what I would use.
So I can recommend.
Thanks.
Okay, Stephanie Schertel-Kufnagel.
Thank you for reminding me to unmute. Thank you, Maya. I really enjoyed this. It's very interesting work. I'm particularly interested in the discussion around the question of gradient responses to boundaries. And as you know, that's a hot issue. And I wonder if you could just remind me, were the labels gradient?
Yes. So I showed the ERP response to the ending of a word. And each word had a score, an acoustic-based boundary score. And that score was a gradient, so it was a scale, basically. So the SUNY algorithm, in a way, potentially also captures these gradient, the different levels of prosodic strength.
Right, but it was not the case that your hand labelers labeled a hierarchy of intonational constituents. I see. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, but it is like a very interesting topic for me also because we then also have studies in linguistics actually also potentially claiming that maybe this binary, is there an intonation unit boundary or not? Is that the right way to look at the data? And maybe like different strengths of prosodic boundary strength can also have a functional relevance, right? And there's like work by Dagmar Barth-Weingarten showing this like in interaction linguistics and of course much more. So yeah.
And there's the question of the intermediate case, which is a hierarchy of boundary strengths. But we can talk about this offline. I'd like to put you in touch with my colleague, Elena Brugos, here in Boston. She has some interesting things to say about that same question. I think you two should talk.
Thank you very much. Okay, so here's my email on this slide.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
More questions online? Okay, then I think we move to the room. Questions here in the Wilhelm Wundt room. Lorenzo?
Thank you, Maya, for the talk. It's very fascinating. And so I'm still a little bit puzzled. Maybe I didn't understand correctly. But this boundary strength scores are derived from this wavelet analysis on several acoustic factors. And then you show that the unique variance that this boundary strength can explain on a G level. And so this is also factoring out because I think I have like all the acoustic factors are still in the model. When you predict it, no, they are sort of like flow into the boundary strength.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe this wasn't your question, but the toolbox I was using, the limo EG, is an event-related thing. So it doesn't allow to have like a continuous time signal. It needs like a variable, like just one point for the window you're regressing against.
Because I mean, as also in the discussion, I was wondering because these intonation units could be also coming from many different things. You mentioned some acoustic factors, so you mentioned also that some of the EG responses that are evoked would also be evoked by other types of linguistic boundaries. So I was thinking if there could be some more like fine-grained cues for segmentations, like for instance, you mentioned the dependencies of phone length, durations, phone lengths, like these are all like factors that contribute together to create an information.
Yeah.
And so all of these like acoustic factors together with more abstract linguistic annotations, if you have an idea on perspective.
Just that I would love to do it. But also like the regression type, doing multiple regression, so you can add a ton of predictors. And like often it's the case that you would add predictors and it would explain really more data. And then there's a selection process to do. So I guess at this very initial level, I wanted to like do the big picture, but there is room. And that's also why I want to go to the TRF, because it allows to do both things. But then the question of how to deal with the abundance of predictors. I mean, do we have the statistical sophistication to do it? I'm still trying to figure it out. Is that where the question comes from? Okay.
I think I'm from exactly using more like other sorts of predictors.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of covariation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think we were asked this by a reviewer. So we computed like the variance inflation factors in our data, and it was low and sort of acceptable. But I know that once you have many more, it can really blow up.
I was just wondering when you were comparing, when you were adding the factor of like close closure, like you had also quite an unbalanced set of stimuli.
Yeah, so that's why we chose to do it. I'll go to the slide. Yeah. So basically what we did was to split the intonation unit closure predictor instead to two categories, intonation unit final and non-final. So to three categories. Okay, intonation unit final and also clause final, intonation unit final and not clause final, and intonation unit non-final. And this really excludes from the analysis. I can't say anything about this category here because it was data. So it ended up being okay in terms of the covariation because it was within one predictor. And I mean, true, this is an imbalance, but the variance seemed to be controlled. So. Thanks.
If I may, I have another question on the first results that you presented on the EG, where you showed some effects at different latencies for stimulus after. Yeah, exactly. So I was wondering what's your interpretation of these results?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess maybe let's look at this slide for a second, okay? Because at first, I must admit, when I saw the right cluster only reaching significance, I was like, oh, but this is supposed to be the more structural component, like intonation unit closure, and we associate the right, like more right towards response to the prosodic means really. So I didn't really know. Then I saw that there's also this negativity on the left. So maybe it's not just a right thing. This by chance hadn't reached significance. I think it's interesting the fact that it starts before word offset also. And yeah, so we of course thought, yeah, I mean, this is just the response to a word offset, but we know that our machine is constantly predicting and is possibly already getting to this end effect. So maybe the fact that it's before word offset reflects this fact. And yeah, this central to posterior component. So as I said, it's very similar to the like CPS response that you see. I have to say that also EEG components related to temporal processing coming from our lab also have this kind of distribution. So yeah, that's an open question, I guess, for me. What processes exactly happening? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking, yeah. Maybe we can discuss.
Okay.
I mean, you can anticipate whether it's a final or non-final word earlier, right? So it's like at least the final syllable, maybe even. So that makes sense. I don't remember a report on the Iran before, but I guess that the Iran studies, they didn't put that's kind of the devil is in the details with that literature, whether they put the trigger for the analysis on the offset or on the onset. So
Sometimes even on the P center.
Yeah. So that is tricky, and assigning functional meaning to the two different ERPs. That's I mean, I had the same question, but it's like
this obviously can be something that is evolving in time, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was probably have to read Daniela Samler's prosody, right hemisphere, big kind of opinion review paper to understand the two phases, and I don't remember what she's proposing in terms of what you say, prediction, maybe prediction error, prediction update.
I should read it too.
In any case, I think this at least allows you to say something about how implicit prosody may be generated internally, right? Even in these contexts, right?
Yeah.
What it has to say about syntax and getting it to the left hemisphere and so on. It's just still open, yeah. I had one question, if I may, and so that question is, yeah, it's out there. The other one was because we got the question by a reviewer recently, is about, we always think still in this bottom-up fashion in a way about what we do with these intonation phrases, right? So, or intonation units. So we reach the end and then we close the box and then we do something with it, yeah. But the reviewer asked us like how we can be sure that this is related to the offset and not the onset. And I didn't have an answer, so we came up with an answer, and it was okay to make the reviewer happy. But it really, we don't, you know. We have thoughts.
I really resonate with that. I mean, you have to choose something. So what I chose the offset because that's what I saw the majority of the CPS literature, let's say, did. But yeah, of course, we're constantly in interpretation. I guess that by the end, we reached the offset of the last word of intonation unit. We already processed it in a way. So yeah, so maybe. I don't know if there's a way to separate if it's onset or preparatory, or maybe an experimental.
I think you need an experiment where you trick people. It's not nice. I was trying to convince. So sorry, you had some thoughts on that, right? Stephanie, you had thoughts on that?
I just have a question. Were you able to look at the difference between a sort of discourse final versus discourse medial intonation end? Because maybe if there is no following onset, you could begin to get a hint of the answer to that question.
That's a great idea, but no, we didn't. So like supposedly annotating each story, like the spontaneous story, to more like discourse structures within it, and then adding another predictor. That can be very interesting. Yeah. And it's possible, I think. It's just, yeah, a lot of work with the data should be done.
I remember just to chime in on that, how Naiding is citing one of your papers, Stephanie, and he has this idea that a lot of this is coming from the motor system. It's like internal shadowing. It's like coming up with kind of preparing the next intonation unit during listening, basically. So kind of your motor system is anticipating what's happening. It's like setting up. That's what you write in your Proceedings of the Royal Society paper, right? That you kind of, that's what you set up. You set up such a long unit in your motor system, right? And probably you do it during listening, but that's a hypothesis, right? No one is really.
In that case, maybe would expect for a different response in conversation to intonation unit ends that end a turn also, and those that do not.
Possibly, yeah. It's hard to test because in a production experiment you will have you will have a readiness potential before they take the turn, and you will have motor preparation, you will have alpha, you have everything that you don't want when you want to compare those two conditions. So that will be an interesting experiment, but it will be hard to implement.
Mm-hmm. So I had this thought of comparing two different production conditions with a slight functional difference between them. So functional difference based on an interactional analysis, but that both include production, basically, a speaker change. I wonder if that would in some way neutralize these effects.
That would be one way to go, I think. Yes, it's a good idea. I think that could be a way to do it, right? Changing on an abstract level the purpose of the speech act and fiddling around with that.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's a slow progress, but it's an interesting direction.
Yeah, but I mean, if I could jump in, I've been thinking for the last few minutes about your question about offset and onset, and I think from a turn-taking perspective, I don't think there is a meaningful difference between the two, like between an offset of a sentence and the start of a new one, because that's not how conversation is organized. I think it's organized between turn relevant places, and that's what the offset of IP is in general, right?
You can get turns with many IPs.
Yeah,
right.
But at every end of the IP, start of a new one, there is this transition relevant place, which is often shown by people back channeling, for example.
I think of there are a few studies looking at the relation between like intonation, phrasing, and the construction of units across it. Yeah, I always seem to position them on like a higher, longer scale. But yeah, I guess back channels would occur more. It's an empirical question. Yeah. Okay.
That's food for thought, I think, for all of us. Thank you very much again for your presentation, and thank us everyone for the lively discussion. Spread the word. The language circle is back in business after the summer break, and we are looking forward to having you all again. Thank you very much.